So this panel is called Working Class Struggle in Queer Politics. I'm Sohomjit Ray. I'll be the facilitator. And our first presenter is Hendrik Quast. Did I pronounce him right? Okay, sorry. Hendrik is a theater maker, performer, and comedy researcher whose work explores the comic potential of the invisible chronically ill body and the experience of becoming disabled through theatrical approaches, with a particular focus on clowning and ventriloquism as methods of artistic investigation. He is currently a PhD candidate at Stockholm University of the Arts and in cooperation with Zurich University of the Arts. The full bio is available online. I encourage you to. His presentation is titled Hairbitus Transplants, Performing Class by Making My Hair Act. It's welcome, Hendrik.
Okay, so it seems like the PowerPoint is now not working, so it's my favorite thing. Do you want to try giving me your flash drive again? Let me try putting it in. Yeah, it was fine, but then it's confusing. I just roughly computer.
Do you need the mic? Okay. I will stick to my script because I'm not native speaking. The only thing that I can already now share is there is a little trigger warning, or I call it content warning. So there will be blood. And I will show some images that involve some blood. But it'll make sense as soon as we see the presentation. If it's too much for you, then and of course leave the room.
Oh, oh my God.
There it is.
Okay. Is this fine? I don't want to catch anything else, and then okay.
You just have to tell me how I navigate here.
Yeah, so you can actually, you're basically using the screen here. But let me actually try it again to see if this works. It didn't before, and it caused me some issues. But let's. Okay,
there we go.
And then you just press that, and your flash drive is here.
Yes, very good. So then I start. Hair can act, it can hide, it can signal, it can pass, and sometimes it performs class. This presentation is a performance lecture. In terms of the reception and the impact of the work that I will present today, this work, or the performance that I'm talking about, namely, it's called Herkunft, has followed a different trajectory compared to my previous works as an artist. It has reached a smaller audience and has often been difficulties to had difficulties to communicate within institutional and media contexts. At the same time, it has received critical recognition within the German-speaking theater field. I understand this reception not as a limitation, but as a part of the work itself. I'm working within a theater or performative art context where class is widely discussed, but still difficult to name. Especially in cultural and institutional settings, there's often no shared language to articulate class differences. This also shapes how the work is read. I'm a performer, theater maker, and comedy researcher with a conceptual approach situated between live art and devised theater. My project Herkunft revolves around my hair transplant, which is understood not as purely a medical procedure, but as a performative and social act. Before my hair transplant in 2024, my beauty doc said to me, anyone can afford to lose their hair. Not everybody can afford to redistribute it. I use my own body and the procedures as material to think about class, visibility, and belonging. I approach this from a queer working class perspective, where belonging is never stable and passing becomes a continuous practice. Following Pierre Bourdieu, I understand class not only as a social position, but as something embodied as habitus. My position is shaped by what he calls a tension within habitus, a mismatch between embodied disposition and the expectations of the field, in my case, the art field, or also the field of higher education. My social mobility does not feel like an arrival. It feels like a repeated coming out, a constant passing. Passing here is not only about class, it is also about a queer and crypt strategy, a way of navigating spaces that are not made for me or you. Why is class shame such an uninvited guest? Because it appears exactly at the moment you start to feel comfortable. This is a joke from my performance Herkunft. Usually no one laughs. Neither do I, because it's a student joke. I underwent this hair transplant as part of my project Herkunft. In this project, I explore techniques of stand-up comedy, starting from the observation that I often use humor to cover class shame and difference. With the hair transplant, I was also trying to cover class shame. I developed a kind of fantasy that I didn't want others, colleagues, audiences to be able to look through me, through the thinning parts of my hair, into my head, my brain, and see the extra labor it takes to move between classes. As a chronically ill body and theater maker living with inflammatory bowel disease, I already had enough to manage. And much of this illness remains invisible, which means it also has to be constantly negotiated when to reveal and when to pass. The body is already the site of exposure. This desire became stronger when I started my PhD in Sweden. A different context, different norms, different hair. I didn't want to fully assimilate, but I want the option to pass. Fake hair, a bald head, or a hairpiece were no options. Too loose, too temporary, too theatrical, or too much make-believe. I wanted to go back to my own roots and even deeper. That's why my new wig had to be permanent. This was also a way of reclaiming the body in relation to norms of health and the bourgeois idea of appearance. A costly form of deficit management made possible through public cultural funding in Germany. Otherwise, I would have not been able to afford it. In earlier works, artistic performative works, I already used wigs intensively. They were tools to negotiate visibility, theatricality, and authenticity, and to question who is speaking within a post-dramatic or within post-dramatic practices. Here, the wig does not hide, it exaggerates. It makes performance visible, and it becomes a tool of passing, but it also fades. It reveals the effort behind performing identity. My permanent wig operates differently. It is not visible only when it chooses to make it become apparent. In the end of Eddie and Change, a Method, Edouard Louis writes about a childhood shaped by violence, alcohol, and poverty in a rural working class background or context. He describes social mobility as a process of becoming someone else. But what interested me are the smaller corrections that accompany this transformation. Teeth, hair, these moments appear in his work and his writings, but they are not really made part of the narrative. If Louis writes about becoming someone else, I'm interested in how this transformation is also produced through material intervention into the body. I understand the hair transplant as both a performance and a method, a way of producing knowledge through performance. I conceptualize a transplant as a permanent wig, a surgical intervention intended to hide something which is then exposed by making it public through performance. This procedure is not only aesthetic, it is political. It unfolds over hours, months, years, and a lifetime. It produces images, it produces a body in transition. It also has no single moment, and it does not end with the surgery. It continues afterwards, and it continues here as I'm speaking in front of you. If I speak from the perspective of the hair, transplantations become migration from the back of the head to the front line, from the margins to the center to the front. I want to stay with this image for a moment and share like a piece of documentation. So I also recorded over this process a lot of voice memos to myself, but I won't share them today. If the video is enough. I try to jump some of the thoughts here. How many minutes do I have left? Okay, good. The space makes me a little nervous, to be honest, because it's very loud, like around the area. So I'm not 100% focused, I must admit, but I try my best to stay focused. So, as I said, the healing process does not end, and neither does the tension within a habitus, from my point of view. What you saw are post-operative images. Hair becomes a resource, material, economic, and symbolic. It is a redistribution of resources, not in the classical sense, but within the body, from the back to the front. I don't claim that hair loss is a class issue, but access to hiding is. It is. I say this once again. So I don't claim that hair loss is a class issue, but access to hiding, it is. So the question is not what the body is, but what the body can afford to become. Who can afford to appear natural? This is what I call the politics of my hair, from a queer working class perspective. These images connect the hair transplant, these images that I wanted to share now. These images also connect the hair transplants to narrative of social mobilities that shaped my early understanding of class, because this projects also a reckoning with Simba from The Lion King. The story in The Lion King follows a familiar structure, what in German we call a Bildungsroman, a narrative of becoming, of leaving, wandering, and finally returning to one's rightful place. But this narrative hides class structures, at least from my perspective, because the kind of return is not available to everybody. It is a privilege, a coming out of heritage. It is not equally possible. My illness is invisible and my class background is invisible. So I make both of them visible through the hair transplant, or also through like a specific form of humor. Humor here is not an aesthetics, it is also epistemological. It produces knowledge about who gets seen and how. It also raises the question of audience, who is the humor for, who gets it. I think of this in relation to cryptime and also to crypt humor, forms that do not aim for immediacy and universal accessibility. The humor I'm working with here is based not on irony. It is about keeping distance. It stays with the body with hair, with what grows, disappears, and has to be managed. My work resists dominant aesthetic frameworks of how bodies, and especially sick bodies, are expected to appear. Language operates differently here. You don't have to understand everything immediately. Sometimes it's about staying with the image, with the hair, with the process, and allowing for a different sense of time, what I would call like a scatological crypt time, a time that does not rush towards resolution. Hair becomes a resource, a material, symbolic, and economic, as I already said, but sometimes it can be lost, distributed, and retransplanted or replanted. And many of the ideas and concepts we use to uphold class norms, even in how a normal body is supposed to prepare. Queer and queer approaches allow me to trouble these norms, not by resolving them, but to stay within the frictions. It is closer to a form of grotesque, sometimes cringe, too close to comfort. A way of staying with the body when it becomes too much. A humor that does not always resolve tension, but holds it. What I'm proposing is to read this procedure as a site where class, body, and public funding and performance intersect. This performance is a search and inquiry. The work is not always easily received. It is sometimes purely attended, as I said, and receive difficult responses. But for those who recognize themselves in it, it can also be deeply affirming. We search for ways of belonging that do not require full assimilation. Hair can act, and sometimes it tells a story that is not supposed to be seen. Thank you very much.
Our next presenter is Caroline Ferrante. Her presentation is called The Zoom Gaze, Mediating Queer Class Solidarities. And Caroline is a PhD student in language, literacy, and culture at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. And her research examines how social recognition and intelligibility are negotiated across digital, cultural, and institutional contexts, with particular attention to class neurodivergence and queer experience. I encourage that you read the rest of the bio online, which is, we're running a little bit behind on time, so I'll just start there.
Thank you very much. Yeah, all good.
You can just scroll here, okay?
Okay.
You just scroll it up.
Gotcha. Okay, we'll figure it out. Thanks. Hi, it's a joy to be here today. And I think originally when I signed up for this workshop, I didn't include my Pawnee name. I'm Caroline Baguette Ferrante. My grandfather gave me the name Little Plum. And so I use that in my academic work. My research examines how digital environments shape participation and recognition. And this presentation is an extension of some of my earlier work in an article entitled The Zoom Gaze, where I examine how digital platforms structure power, self-perception, and attention, and especially how visibility is produced within those environments. Let's see what I'm doing here. So just drag it up, arrow up. Scroll down. I'm not sure. I'm sorry, how am I doing? Oh, it worked? Okay. Thank you. Okay, let's take off the academic hat and let's just talk as humans. Okay. Have you ever been in a meeting and you had something to offer and time ran out and you never got to share it? So how did that land? Now let's do a thought experiment. Let's say that in that meeting, somebody else said exactly what you were going to say. How would that feel? Would you be satisfied? I mean, the content is out there, right? You were like, not really, right? Can you relate with that? Why not? It's because participating in interactions contributes to a sense of belonging. It's not just about being seen in a space. It's not just about inclusion or being represented in a space. It's about mattering in the space. And that happens through interaction. And I had a similar experience. Last year, in an online meeting for genderqueer graduate students, I found myself struggling to get into the conversation. The meeting was very gender affirming, but because it moved so quickly, I just couldn't find a way in, and I couldn't figure out what to do about it. So by the end, I just gave up because I didn't want to interrupt and I didn't want to sound out of place. I was raised, perhaps like some of you, in a working class family where we were strictly taught not to interrupt and to respect authority and hierarchies. I came from Kansas, where my grandfather was a farmer and a Pawnee storyteller, and I identify as Kusat, which is the Pawnee third gender. I was already very exhausted before this online meeting. I was working 3 jobs at the time and supporting an adult neurodiverse child. So in addition to these conversational struggles, I found myself comparing in that video tile side-by-side presentation, my gender identity, my gender expression, and others, and making some comparisons because there they are in side-by-side. And I found myself wondering, do I even belong here? My haircut, my clothes just didn't match what I was seeing in that space because I didn't have time or resources to spend time on it. It reminds me of a line from queer spoken word artist Andrea Gibson about spending money on a haircut designed to look like you can't afford it. And it highlights how markers of marginality can themselves become recognizable styles. To some people, that's an aesthetic choice. To me, it wasn't a choice. It was my material lived condition. So from my position as a working class, later in life queer person, my ability to come out was shaped by material constraints, including the risk of losing employment because I had no safety net. This online experience informs my understanding of participation and recognition in queer spaces more broadly. For many working class LGBTQ individuals, coming out is shaped by things like employment, housing, and caregiving responsibilities, which can delay or constrain when identity can be safely expressed. There we go. So on to the research question. This paper argues that participation in online queer spaces depends not just on identity, but on recognizable communication and presentation styles, and that digital interaction norms can inadvertently privilege middle-class forms of speech and participation. Virtual meeting platforms like Zoom potentially exacerbate class stratification within online spaces. In the Zoom gaze, with these side-by-side video arrangements in self-view, it promotes self-scrutiny, normative alignment, and it amplifies cues that can lead to othering for queer individuals. Also, this mechanism could reinforce middle-class normative alignment in shaping discourse and solidarities in the experience of queer online communities. So I'm going to share with you a framework, and I'll break it down a little bit. To illustrate this, I'll take 3 levels of communication: class-based norms, interactional expectations, and digital platforms. And together, these shape the conditions under which participation becomes recognizable. So let's take a look at the first: cultural and class norms. Sociologists have long shown that communication styles are shaped by class. Class is not a matter of income. It's reflected in patterns of socialization and interaction. Most famously, Annette Lareau's analysis of childhood interactional styles explored how middle class and upper middle class children of many different races all developed these direct communication styles that readily challenged and engaged with institutions. And Bourdieu demonstrates how those forms of speech can function as cultural capital, shaping recognition. And further, Lamont highlights how social groups evaluate credibility through shared cultural criteria. And of course, these patterns are also shaped by racialized and cultural forms of communication and norms of communication, which influence how credibility, expressiveness, and engagement are interpreted within interaction. So let's look at the second level. Interactional expectations. Participation, mattering, depends on interaction and being present within that interaction. Just like that, hey, I was going to say that. You know, hey, that's what I was thinking. Our need to do that. That's what it is to be visible in an interaction. And conversations have implicit rules of timing, entry, and response. Goffman describes this as the interaction order, and pragmatist sociologists emphasize that meaning emerges through participation as it unfolds. So in this sense, participation is not just about speaking, not just about speaking, but about being recognized within the interaction, our experience of wanting to put forward whatever it was we were going to offer. Okay, now I'm having problems with my computer. There we go. Okay, lastly, let's take a look at digital platforms. So online communities have been historically crucial spaces for negotiating queer identity. However, digital platforms can intensify interactional dynamics by structuring conversational timing and visibility. Platforms privilege conversational styles that move quickly. Have you ever experienced that? Raise your hand if you've had trouble getting in on a conversation on a digital platform. Yeah, I see a lot of nodding heads. Okay, not just me. Beautiful. Participants must navigate when to speak without interrupting, and that's tricky because we don't have the cues that are available in a face-to-face embodied interaction. And working class interactional styles are less oriented towards interruptions or rapid entry into conversations. And we tend to, of course, not like one stroke for everybody, but there's some groupings and tendencies that we tend to be more deferential to hierarchies and perceived authority. Furthermore, lower working class cultures tend to be collectivistic, in which individuals conceive of themselves as interconnected with others. And so we can be very highly attuned to in-group expectations and contexts. So this makes it more difficult for us working class folks to remain visible in digital spaces. Remember, unlike face-to-face interactions where we are physically present, like here, if I nod my head or I lean in, a lot of you are giving me something back. There's something embodied. We were talking about this. So we're talking about that embodied interaction. It's a little bit like playing ping pong, right? But when that's happening in a flattened reality of a Zoom space or another digital platform, those obligations that we have to each other are flattened and reduced. Virtual platforms with side-by-side technical affordances especially disproportionately sideline collectivistic working class voices, exacerbating classed sexual hesitancies and silences. Work with me. Here we go. All right, so let's bring those three together. And I'm going to offer to you a lens. I like to call it communicative legibility. It's how we describe certain communication styles that become visible in digital interaction. If the Zoom gaze describes how visibility and attention are structured in digital interaction, communicative legibility describes how participation becomes recognized as meaningful, as coherent, that it matters. And this phenomenon is not neutral, but it's shaped by intersecting class, racialized, and cultural expectations about what counts as appropriate. And it doesn't stop at interaction. This recognition is only social, but it can become a site of value as forms of visibility are taken up and circulated within broader cultural and economic systems. Participation depends not on what's just said, but whether it fits the expectational norms around us in that space. Contributions that align with largely upper middle class communication styles like rapid timing, verbal competence, and shared cultural reference, they are more readily recognized as meaningful. And as I argue in my Zoom Gaze work, these platforms don't just transmit interaction, they shape how attention is organized, how power is perceived within the interaction. So who gets heard? Who's seen as engaged? And who feels visible? Who feels like they make sense in that space? Within online queer spaces, these dynamics shape who counts. And those who are more observant, reflective, or direct, like me, and often very largely working class interaction styles, we find our ways to kind of avoid the conversation algorithms because we're trying to follow a rule and a framework that we're raised with. So as a result, class-shaped differences in communication style can influence who is seen and who is heard. So why does all this matter? Inclusion is not presence. Being in the room is not inclusion. Being in the room is not belonging. If we examine communicative legibility, it shows us that it's not just who's there, but whose communication and interaction, whose offerings are being responded to and received within the space. And I want to take it a little bit further. This raises a broader question about visibility itself, and particularly how certain forms of identity and expression become more recognizable and then more valuable within institutional and market contexts. Because a lot of these online ways of curating what is queerness, what are the recognizable or the legitimate forms of queerness that we're going to call normal in these spaces, that will affect what's moving on more widely to what's extracted and lifted up as norms of queerness. In this sense, recognition is not just about participation, but it's much more than the interaction. It's how it can reproduce existing structures of power. Future research should explore how multimodal communication mechanisms, I would suggest things like breakout rooms, time boxes, structured sharing, waterfall chat prompts, and other kinds of modalities that can easily be inserted into these spaces rather than just kind of an open-ended, everybody just vie for yourself. By using some of those multimodal strategies, we find that they disrupt some of those mediating factors. This project is part of a broader research trajectory where I'm tracing how recognition is structured from the visibility of the Zoom gaze to communicative legibility and participation. And then in my dissertation work, I'm looking at broader cultural and historical conditions that shape intelligibility. Thanks so much for being here. Appreciate it.
Our next presenter is Dominic Wetzel. Dominic is an associate professor of sociology at CUNY Kingsburg, where he facilitates the Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies faculty reading group. And his presentation is titled Reimagining a Future Worth Fighting For, Queer Liberation, the Working Class, and the Great Refusal. Welcome, Dominic. Yeah.
I don't need
Oh, you're presenting?
Yeah.
Okay, I thought the British too was.
Okay.
That's okay.
Okay.
Do your thing.
No. Okay. So, I'm partly working off something I wrote recently that's hopefully going to end up in a collection on the crisis of masculinity titled Masculinity and Its Discontents, Reconsidering the Hypermasculine Construction of Jesus in Evangelical and Charismatic Discourse. So I'm drawing on that a little bit, but partly what's happened in my research, which partly draws on research on the Catholic charismatic movement and charismatic Christianity in general, which has been growing for a while. Partly I found myself grappling with the role of Marcuse, you know, the threat of cultural Marxism, right? And so that's partly what I'm with this presentation is about, is looking at how to deal with this charge. And it's something that I find in the religious research I'm doing, and also I guess, you know, at this point we all know about, right? We all know we're all being accused of being cultural Marxists, whatever that is exactly, right? It's the new bogeyman. It's the new phantasmatic threat, as Judith Butler partly puts it. Like one idea is that and you see books coming out. What's the first guy? One of the guys who started off, David. What's his name? I already blocked it off. David Horowitz, right? The ex-Marxist. He wrote something in a queer on the book Queer Materialism. Material Queer in the 90s, and like he went off the rails. So he's been accusing us all of being cultural Marxists. Apparently he was one, so he should know, I guess. I mean, but within the religious realm, partly, and not just the religious realm, one of the accusations is that you know, someone like Marcuse, who talks about a new sensibility, right, in the 60s, make love, not war, wants to make men soft, right? Wants to make us it's like forced feminization, or just feminizing us, you know, queers, trans, you know, trans people literally is like trying to make men into women, all these things, bathrooms, whatever. So, and if you look at like his last article, one of his last writings, like Marxism and Feminism, he is arguing, like he argues in lots of places, that things like the industrial capitalism's performance principle has sort of made us all toxic and ruined, and men in particular, but not only, and how we should maybe think about that and reflect on it and advocate for a slightly different you know, mentality. So, but if you look at that, you can think, wow, oh my God, Marcuse is saying we should be like, men should be like women, and like, oh my God, and now there's the manosphere, and we're all screwed, and you know, and now there's movements to make Jesus manly again, and like, what are we gonna do? Run away, right? Let's just run away and hide. It sounds really scary, cultural Marxism too, right? It's like Maoism or something. My argument is going to be that instead of running away, let's turn around and embrace the challenge. Let's revisit Marcuse. And I thought this is a good place to do it, right? Because it's a queer class conference. Why not? And let's look at it and let's see what's going on with what is it again? What is cultural Marxism? And how might we respond to it instead of meaningfully, instead of running away? Maybe there's some ideas in Marcuse worth looking at again. I don't know. So, so to go back, like, okay, who's Marcuse? Adorno, Frankfurt School, like, partly these were the sort of philosophical Marxist Jews that left Nazi Germany and came to the United States, and part of the problem they sort of foreshadowing postmodernism. They were grappling with the problematic of like what happened to the revolutionary working class agency, right? All right, remember the old leftist thing was that the working class was going to bring in a new society and it was all going to be radical, revolutionary, and all these things, right? Fast forward to, you know, the 40s, 50s, you've got fascism, you've got consumerism, you've got, you know, pre-Trumpism, you know, in 1950s America. And so they're thinking, well, what happened? Well, they think, well, the critical consciousness of the working class got co-opted, right, by the system, by consumerism in the West and by bureaucratic totalitarianism in the East. So that revolutionary potential got neutralized or contained, right? So then Adorno says, I'm going to be a grump and I'm going to complain for a long time about everything. Marcuse, who's like more of a romantic, says, well, I'm not going to give up here. Let me try to, like, you know, maybe there are other revolutionary agencies. Maybe the working class will come back someday. But for now, they're not very like they're not like the hardcore Marxists, the old left were like the working class always has the answer. They thought were pretty delusional. You know, the answer seems to be, you know, keep women barefoot and pregnant, and and smear the queer, and things like that. So that's not very radical. So Marcuse says, what other agencies might be available? Artists, art is supposed to resist what is, what could, and advocate for what could be. Feminism was an emerging, social movement, like the other half of the population. Maybe we should listen to what they have to say. Hippies were a little stinky and weird, but hey, they got him to smoke a joint at a conference and whatnot. So that was an option. Outsiders, malcontents, third world revolutionaries, right? Environmentalists, that was a new thing. And part of his critique was of this sort of reality principle of sort of this hangover from industrial capitalism of the performance principle of having to chop up, destroy the world through science and technology. And so environmentalism was an interesting option. Also intellectuals, if the working class couldn't do it themselves, maybe intellectuals had a role to play in helping educate people, the workers, for critical consciousness. And then you have, teachers, nurses. We're also unionizing. Are they working class or are they not? That's another question. So Marcuse has this idea of the new sensibility, and he's known as sort of the father of the '60s, partly because he said, listen. So he takes a Freudian approach, but he's saying, the problem today is that, under the performance principle, the death drive is sort of the life drive is being driven into the death drive, right? And we should be embracing the life drive more, and out of that comes the slogan, "Make love, not war," right? Which is, let's stop dominating the environment, let's stop dominating each other, let's stop dominating the world, etc. Now, 50 years later, I would say, the more dominant mantra seems to be make war, not love, right? What happened? And partly in my research in religion, I think what happened is that in the 1980s, by the 1980s, spiritual warfare. Anyone ever heard of spiritual warfare? Yeah, it's big in religion. This idea of good versus evil and whatnot has become, it's a simple idea, but it's very powerful. And within religion and the religious right, and the idea of dominion, which is sort of this theocracy that real Christians need to occupy important sectors of society, including the government, in order to lead, so that Jesus will come back today or whatever, back someday. Not today, someday, not today. Jesus, someday, maybe tomorrow. Anyways, But yeah, so these are things that often you're kind of below the secular radar. Although now we're learning more about them because they've become so influential. But and then you see in the manosphere you have this open embrace now, both religious and not religious manospheres, right? Of aggression, right? Alpha male energy is the solution to everything: poverty, job loss, impotence, getting turned on dates, everything is alpha male energy, and our orange-haired hero, who I learned recently models his orange hair on Howard Rourke from Ayn Rand's The Fountainhead, which I just read half of because I read Lisa Duggan's Mean Girl, so I had to read Ayn Rand. It's kind of makes a lot of sense. Some of the things that are going on today. In any case, so you also have, well, one of the things in my research kind of came up is shepherding. Anyone ever heard of shepherding? The shepherding. So in charismatic Christianity, this idea of this male shepherding, cell groups led by male leaders, which is what led to the Promise Keepers and all these things, and the Handmaid's Tale, right? The handmaid was a female leader. This is big, and it's all kind of been pushed down, but it was big in the whole formation of Catholic charismatic stuff and broader Pentecostal charismatic Christianity, in the Catholic, and it was a way to subvert feminism, gay rights, all these things from the beginning. One thing people don't know is that for instance, in the Catholic charismatic movement, which Amy Coney Barrett is part of, the early female leaders were called handmaids, but then that title was taken away because it was seen as giving them too much power because it gave them a title. So they actually took away the title of handmaid, and then later brought it back when women have been properly subdued. So it's actually crazier than people realize. In any case, what's going on today? We've got charismatic Christians, we've got fundamentalist religions, we've got rad trads now coming back in Catholicism and whatnot. We've got the right attacking Marcuse, but also like in cultural Marxism, but also appropriating in a weird way, right? Like the right likes to rip off the left. It's like we're living through partly some form of right-wing Maoism where the right is all, like we all know men are good and women are bad and like, and all these weird kind of things going on. There's a movement to like for the Republicans to take back the working class, right? That's this whole thing, partly by pitting, the cultural Marxists of queers and trans people and against the true male working class, family values people, etc. So my question again, my proposal here is like, why don't we revisit? There's some interesting ideas within Marcuse and this era. Partly about I'll give you two obvious like things here. One, 50 years later, as neoliberalism has unraveled the high level of working class standard of living, perhaps it's a good time to revisit the question of whether or not the working class has been contained by capitalism, right? I mean, it's not as contained. I mean, and now we're seeing two options emerge, fascism and socialism, roughly speaking. The middle road centrism is sort of like kind of falling apart a bit. So it's an interesting question, the right is certainly, the Steve Bannon types are certainly trying to like make a move for the working class. Maybe we should, well, look at this conference. Maybe we should like take that a little bit seriously again. And Marcuse in particular does a really good reflection on evaluating the working class, the pluses and negatives and what's going on. So there's that. Then there's also one of the big things that Marcuse and friends like to talk about is science and technology. We assume science and technology is here to liberate us, but is it oppressing us, right? Nuclear weapons, pollution, AI, and he's always saying, listen, science and technology should be here to liberate us, but it's often here to dominate us, right? This seems like a relevant question to have today. Some people are like, yeah, well, AI is going to do all these wonderful things, right? What did Elon Musk said? All of us we're not gonna have to work anymore. We are not gonna have to work anymore because the robots will do all the work and then we'll all be able to enjoy the life. That's like Marx's communism, right? Slight detail. Who's going to control the technology, the AI? Oh, well, we just skipped over that. So why don't we look at that? And I think that Marcuse centralizes the role, that evaluation of what is science and technology doing? How is it being used? Is it being used to oppress or liberate? I think that's quite worthwhile. And then also like the performance principle. How much time do I have? 2 minutes. 2 minutes, good. So he looks at the performance principle as this industrial hangover, and he helps kind of create the 60s because he points out things like repressive desublimation, or an excessively repressive society, right? And that he points out this sort of Protestant industrial like repression thing. 60s kind of changes that. People critique him for sort of the repressive hypothesis thing, but actually Wilhelm Reich is more is a better person to critique for that, because Marcuse always leaves room for the idea. Well, one of the central concepts is repressive desublimation, which is the idea that just because you're having desublimation and doesn't mean that you're being liberated, right? Sex sells doesn't mean just because you're like showing boob or leg, or sugar these days, doesn't mean just because you're having pleasure doesn't mean that it's actually in service of anything particularly liberatory. So actually Foucault and Marcuse are not that different on that question. So, and when you look at some of this last stuff on Marxism and feminism, it's very interesting. Like he provides certain options of ways to critique masculine, the baggage that masculinity has inherited from the performance principle era, when men were the only providers, or the masculine, body, when you needed strength in the factory or the farm or whatever. He has an interesting reflection on that and on how maybe we need to let go of a lot of this stuff and how can we re-examine that. And also just the idea of maybe having empathy maybe men and boys and masculinities need should try having empathy for themselves and for others again. Or we could go with a Ayn Rand future where it's as Gore Vidal said in his review, Zixies, one for one and none for all. Is that the future we want? I don't know what Lee Edelman would say, but hey, I think it's worth like taking the challenge to imagine the future. Like what if queers have to offer along with maybe perhaps critical consciousness awakening, working class, and other agencies to articulate an interesting future. I think that's not something we should run away from. I think we should, and in fact, maybe it's not bad that the right, this well-funded right, that's busy, trying to use all of our own stuff against us, to bring back some of these questions and some of these ideas, and maybe they'll fund it. We can have a forum. We'll have a nice conversation about it. I don't know. So that's kind of partly this is from my own research in religion, seeing this weird way in which, on the one hand, it looks like, oh my God, like queers and trans people and all, these monsters are trying to make men into women and it's kind of true and we're done. And it's like, so what? Let's have the question. Let's have the debate. What's really going on here? And let's look at these cultural Marxist ideas. Let's look at Marcuse again and whoever, and let's have the debate. It might be good for everyone. So that's my sort of work in progress, my emerging response to this threat, this criticism of cultural Marxism coming from the right, just as a challenge that we should embrace and set up some debates about. Thank you for listening.
The next presenter is Sharif Mowlabocus, who is a professor of communication and media studies at Fordham University. His research is located primarily at the intersection of digital media studies and queer theory, and he's the author of 2 books, Gaydar Culture and Interrogating Homosexuality.
It's just in a
along with
PDF,
over
so
20 articles,
yeah, it just
chapters. His presentation is titled
right. I see.
Facts and Perverts, LGSM, Pride, and the Erasure of British Queer Class Relations. Let's welcome Sharif Mowlabocus.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Oh, it's so weird that I haven't got it here. But yeah, got it. Hi everyone. Sorry. Am I loud enough, or would you like to? Yeah. You would say that, Nick. Thank you, everyone. I don't get to present research very often these days. Running a department, so it's a real honor to be here. So I want to begin by talking about the miners' strike. And I can make this. Yeah, okay. So the British miners' strike of 1984 into March 1985 remains the most well-known instance of collective action against the neoliberal policies of Margaret Thatcher's government. So if you want to trace the origins of neoliberalism in the United Kingdom, you go to Margaret Thatcher and you go to this. Policies that went on to radically reprogram the British economy and which decimated working class lives. Ultimately unsuccessful in its bid to halt the closure of 20 coal mines. It's hard to underplay just how pivotal this strike was in both the ensuing decline of the British coal industry and the success of Margaret Thatcher's vision of a socially conservative society underpinned by free market economics, a radical deregulation of all industrial sectors, and a political defanging of trade unions. So within 10 years of the strike ending, the Conservative government had sold off more than 40 state-run businesses to the private sector. And with that, they sold out over 600,000 workers who moved from being part of the public sector, protected through particular union rules and pensions and benefits and so on and so forth, into private ownership, working for companies in private hands.
And this was accompanied by new legislation that eroded the power of those trade unions that were associated with these particular industries. And so any understanding of the decline of the British working class and working class politics in the UK must recognise the pivotal role that this strike played in that history. And while the working class were the target of Thatcher's economic reforms, LGBTQ people were in the crosshairs when it came to her government's social policy. I'm sorry you had to look at her. So in 87, so she defeats the miners. She starts completely ripping the guts of the manufacturing base in the United Kingdom, and then she goes for queers. So she says at the Conservative Party conference, children who need to be taught to respect traditional moral values are being taught that they have an inalienable right to be gay. And this verbal attack set the stage for the passing of Section 28. And if you're not familiar with Section 28, basically it prohibited any organisation or institution that received public funding, think education here, from, and I quote, intentionally promoting homosexuality or promoting the teaching in any maintained school or the acceptability of homosexuality as a pretended family relationship. Now, there was never a single successful prosecution under Section 28, but it did its job. 15 years of complete silencing of any discussion of LGBTQ lives in schools, colleges, and even universities, save for in the context of disease. So in the mid-1980s, you've got two groups here, one financially disenfranchised and the other one socially marginalised. And these are being demonized by the Tory government and also by the right-wing media as well. So we see this opportunity for coalition building to appear. And that's where we see the emergence of lesbians and gays support the miners. So it was founded by Mark Ashton, a leading figure in the British Communist Party's Youth League. They were set up to raise money for the Welsh mining towns of Neath and Delace and Swansea during the strike. And they raised over £90,000 in today's money. And the support for these working class communities played a pivotal role in the National Labour Party subsequently supporting LGBTQ people. And it's their story that was brought to the big screen in 2014 by screenwriter Stephen Beresford and director Marcus Walkus. And I begin by saying Pride is a really important film, in my opinion, in that it taught queer folk in Britain something about our history. It offered us a glimpse into a world of activism that went beyond the fight for gay rights, because while it didn't ignore those issues, it put them into conversation with the labour movement and the broader class struggle. So given that's what Pride talks about, why is the title of my paper suggesting that the film actually erases queer class relations? And to be clear, I actually love this film. I watched it just the other night. I'm tearing up by the end of whatever. I'm a real sucker for it, and there's a lot to love. At the time, more people knew about Stonewall, okay, an event that happened in the 69 in the United States, than they knew about LGSM in the UK, which happened in the 1980s. So I think it's an important film. And it seems weird to suggest that it erases queer class relations, because surely that's what the whole film is about. And yet, produced 30 years after the miners' strike and the formation of LGSM, this film has a really challenging job, because it has to contend with this particular political reality. That from a place of solidarity through shared oppression in the 1980s, LGBTQ politics in Britain and those of the working class have ended up on very different trajectories. So it's impossible. Okay, yeah, my words, AI did the design because I can't do design. Okay, it's impossible not to agree that for many LGBTQ people in the UK, especially middle class folk, things have been on an upward curve since the mid-1980s. And the end of the 1980s. And I put some up here, okay. You contrast this with some of the legislation that has negatively affected the working class, and you can see a very, very different picture. And so Pride not only has to contend with these two very different trajectories, okay, it also has to accommodate the fact that the improvement in the lives of some of those queer folk actually has come at the expense of the working class. And for the sake of time, I'll just give you one particular example of this. And this is my wonderful colleague, Kath Brown, who is now back in Ireland, actually. Kath, writing in 2011, identified the role that UK legislation pertaining to same-sex relationships played in actually reducing access to benefits for working class people. So in 2004, kind of prior to the advent of gay marriage, we had the Civil Partnership Bill. Okay, same-sex couples in the UK received the opportunity to have their relationships legally recognised, and they broadly got pretty much the same kind of package of financial and legal rights as married couples. There are some important absences there. And this was rightly considered a landmark victory in the history of lesbian and gay rights, and you'd understand that. But as Kath Brown points out, the rewards of this victory were no means evenly spread, because in fact, as a direct result of that partnership, okay, the domestic relationships of all queer folk, and importantly here, including queer folk who are in relationships and receiving state benefits, those relationships were automatically reclassified overnight, okay? Meaning that even if you didn't enter into a civil partnership, when it came to benefits, you were treated as if you had. So overnight, an unknown number of poor, unemployed and underemployed queer folk who lived with a partner and who relied on welfare payments became part of a new couple in the eyes of the state. As the state rather, and living as a couple affects the amount of state benefits you can receive. Namely, it drops the amount of benefits that you can receive. So this reclassification was immediate, though it was really badly communicated, like people didn't know. And yet at the same time, instantly, benefit recipients became responsible for registering this new status. And if they didn't, they actually were subject to prosecution for welfare fraud. So this is one example of how the benefits of British LGBTQ activism have often been most keenly felt by middle-class couples, and the cost of that activism has often been disproportionately borne by the working class, especially working class queers. And so the Civil Partnership Bill is one example of how consecutive British governments post-Thatcher have promoted the rights of LGBT people, often doing so to demonstrate how socially progressive they are. But at the same time, those same governments, sometimes via the very same acts of Parliament, have eroded the support that many working class people rely on. And remember, that reliance on, for instance, welfare benefits is a direct result, generations of dependence is a direct result of the destruction of the mining industry, but also the manufacturing base as well. So you can see whole not dole. Dole is a colloquial British term for welfare benefits. This is what the miners were arguing about, right? This is what they were protesting about. We do not want to be recipients of state benefits. We want to work, okay? We want to continue in these particular industries. So there's this ideological gulf between the political energy that spawned LGSM, okay, in 1984, and the political agenda that came to dominate LGBT politics in the following 3 decades. And I would argue that this inevitably shapes the narrative frames that are employed in a film like Pride, because Pride celebrates the politics of solidarity, but it has to do a lot of work to contain this approach to social justice through narrative techniques that resonate with a more individualistic neoliberal political era in order to sell that film. And there are 2 specific examples of that narrative work happening. I'm a media and communications scholar, which is why I've kind of been thinking about film and the ways in which we tell these stories, you know, in contained ways. So the first one is that nice young boy from the suburbs, Bromley Joe. So many of the characters in Pride are based on real characters, but arguably the kind of central protagonist, the way in which we see the film, the way in which we're introduced to the film, is Bromley Joe. He's a fictional character created by the writer Stephen Beresford. We see that Pride is about the miners' strike and the LGSM, but the story that tells us that, okay, is actually the story of Bromley Joe, a nice, white, middle-class young man from the homophobic suburbs who moves to the city to be gay. And of course, that's a really well-worn framework that we're very, very familiar with. And by embodying this archetype of the kind of wide-eyed young ingenue, Joe operates as both the audience's way into the film, so he's the narrative vehicle through which we encounter LGSM, we encounter the Welsh working class, and we encounter the kind of struggles, okay? But he's also, I would argue, the audience's way out of the film, because Joe represents the future, okay? He epitomizes the forward-looking optimism that engendered the post-Thatcher era, embodied in the Labour government's mantra that things can only get better. And this hope of a new life is thrown into relief, or rather throws into relief, the older politics of the radical left. And that's a politics which by the end of the film is killed off metaphorically, okay, via a title card that informs the audience that Mark Ashton's death from AIDS. So Mark Ashton, who sets up LGSM, the leader of the Communist Youth League in the UK. This is kind of what we learn about him at the end. So in Bromley Joe, the audience gets to enjoy the history of LGSM, but from a position that reaffirms the subsequent path down which mainstream LGBT movement in the UK heads. And in case we start to feel a bit uncomfortable about that, the politics of the third way and how actually leaders such as Tony Blair and David Cameron and Nick Clegg embody a politics for the middle class. The film also offers another title card, celebrating the subsequent political success of one working class woman, namely Sian Williams. Now, Sian Williams is a real life person, unlike Bromley Joe, and she is fantastic, okay? She's spoken candidly of how the miners' strike became her political awakening, setting her on a road towards higher education, local politics, and eventually the Welsh National Assembly as a member of the Welsh Labour Party. So she's a remarkable woman. But the director's choice to single out Williams and her achievement, I would suggest, risks marginalising the larger story of the mining community, which unfolds beyond the end of the film. Decades of poverty, underinvestment, poor educational outcomes, and community erosion. Instead, the working class is represented by Sian Williams, the cinematic version here, celebrated because she gets out. Where Joe escapes the homophobic suburbs, Williams escapes the working class life of the mining village. And she's used in the film to embody that most neoliberal of commands to be your best self. And in doing so, to take responsibility for one's success and also failures. So the end result is this story of this fantastic moment of solidarity, but packaged in a particular way that does not challenge the really quite fractured way in which lesbian and gay politics in the UK in the ensuing decades has not just left behind working class solidarity, but has actually often benefited at their particular cost. So, given this critique, you might wonder why might wonder that I dislike it, but the truth is I really have a genuine fondness for the film. I think it does, you can love a text and still critique it. I repeat myself when I say that Pride is a really important film. It informs current and future generations of the role that queer folk once played in one of Britain's longest running industrial disputes, which continues to leave an indelible mark on both the cultural psyche of the nation and on the lives of those directly involved. But as I said, it's possible to love a film while also challenging it. And I think it's really interesting to think of a film like Pride that's really trying to do fantastic work and think about what kinds of normative frames of narrative, of storytelling and of characterization are required in order for this to be something that can be released in the box office, kind of in the mainstream. And I hope that this is something that we can also think about in relation to other films that are talking about solidarity, but often from a position that is working within a neoliberal economy. And I'll end there. Thank you.
We have very little time left for question and Q&A, but yeah, questions, comments.
So yeah, you don't have a lot of time. We just want to point out the question of value. Since we were talking about cultural Marxism, but not the critic from the right, critic from the left. How we can go, I mean, especially your work about recognition and in the time of communicating capitalism and creating and other people talks about. So how we can go beyond this fantasy of empowerment and the whole thing, because then we need to go beyond Marcuse and the whole Western Marxism, I would say, from the question of consumption to the question of production. How you can, we don't have time now, I know, but I mean, how you can include the question of value from the solid Marxism into this conversation?
Interesting question. Probably a little bit too broad for my career, since I'm looking more at interactional dynamics. I think it's a really crucial question.
You mean how can we get beyond the consumer capitalism and go back to
Because I don't think Marcuse can give us anything. I mean, this
Well-
this new book that who plays the fighters of Western Marxism by David Rocky and the whole critique of the left. These are serious, not by him, but generally, because the word was not United States and imperial core. And at the same time that we were talking about the minor, a lot of things were going on in beyond the imperial core things in terms of, the whole contradiction.
I mean, I just think that like it's interesting that the right is inviting us to re-engage with some of these ideas. I think some ideas are worth looking at, partly because Marcuse is doing this, his group is doing this sort of critical rethinking of some of the things that are assumed by the old left, that the working class is always going to do X, Y, and Z, and also that is performance, is how much production do we need to do, and particularly unnecessary toil, some of those questions like how much work do we need to do or not, maybe we can have machines do more work, I don't know, all these things, let's think about it instead of assuming we already know all the answers, which is what the old left tended to do, so that's more, but you're talking more in a more international sense, is that what you're?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not comparing our time with Marcus. You're talking about the context of the Cold War. I mean, these are like declassified documents at CIA, and all these things, not necessarily directly that Marcus is a bad good, but this is a very certain Cold War context. We need to, have to pause and think of that.
But I would just say, I think
this course is actually.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to revisit the role of the working class, is just given neoliberalism, and look at Trumpism. Trumpism is this weird right wing mobilization of the working class. Maybe it's an interesting time to think about what the working class's relationship to capitalism and consumer capitalism or whatever era we're in now is. And think about that. Certainly the Steve Bannons are doing it and they're being funded with a lot of people. So maybe we should also be putting in some competition, not to romanticize the working class, unnecessarily. Yeah, but.
So I guess my question is, to my understanding, the right does not really focus on the words cultural Marxism in a genuine way, but more of in a way where they talk about, critical race theory and that they talk about it incorrectly, because they're all using it as a code word. And I'm kind of wondering, do you have any feelings on how, because us as scholars, we spend a lot of our time focusing on what people who aren't us are saying about us. Do you have any feelings about do you think that is taking some of our time from talking about other pursuits, or do you find it maybe fulfilling in a scholarly way?
I think it's a strategic move. And also I'm studying religious stuff, so I'm kind of forced to be a little bit reactive. But I think that partly what the right is doing is they're taking their money and they're they're trying to appropriate some good ideas from the past and use it against us. And in a weird way, I think that they're making an error, because if we turn around and take them seriously, we get to actually re-engage some things that are worth re-engaging and that need to be updated. Not that Marcuse, this is dated, but it's the problematic that he's engaging with, not bad. And in some ways, they're using our own ideas against us. And so let's so you know what I'm saying? I think if you like get past the superficial like ideas, but that's easy to do. We have to do that anyways. You know what I'm saying? That,
Yeah, I mean, to be clear, I'm not a Marxist scholar myself.
Uh-huh.
I'm a scholar of like 1990s trans stuff, but mostly like 70s to 2000s, but especially 90s. But I guess my question is more, it feels, I don't know, I think that we do spend a lot of time engaging with people who are kind of throwing phantasms at us. So it can be a useful thought exercise, but yeah, I was just curious about you.
I see transness as linked to sort of anarchism, and like I see, Marcuse was the first person to say, well, maybe we need to like put the pop.
It kind of is,
Yeah.
but not really.
But I'm just loosely groupings, like, and Marcuse to me is the person who put the pause button on the working class radicalism and helped open the question of, is it the queers? Is it the feminists? Is it the radical? Is it the anarchists? Is it the trans people who are potential revolutionary subjects? So, and that's the move that he kind of, and postmodern goes in his own direction. But like, I think it's an interesting question, because he's opening it up and saying, instead, like, what are the other radical agencies, right? Including trans people, queers, feminists, youth, right? People of color, third world revolution. Like, who are these other people that we could make, that could come together and become this agent of change? Like, I think that the right is trying to make their own little, like, let's get all the men, the working class men who hate and get to hate trans people and queer people, and we'll make them the new revolutionary agent, and then we'll link them up with the billionaire hedge fund people, tech bros. And we'll create this Ayn Rand fantasy where Ayn Rand Maoist fantasy where, whatever. I think that's kind of what they're doing. So I think that we like, I guess I think that like what certain things that Marcuse is doing are very related. Like we are like a queer trans, cultural warriors. Like, I don't think that's all bad. I think that people who believe in what they believe in have to cobble together some kind of a political formation with other people to try to imagine a new future. So I think it's an interesting, thought exercise and important to do. Otherwise, we're all compartmentalized.
If I might,
Yeah,
that for me is where I find it really interesting. Is like is the ways in which the kind of single issue identity politics that we did see kind of within the kind of like liberal third wave has been co-opted by the right as a tool of, and actually by engaging all of those subjects, it's really, I always find it hilarious when they're kind of like, you're right that they're using trans folk or queer folk or people of color, critical race theory or whatever to buoy up the working class and rile them up against it. It's like, what about the working class queers? What about the working class trans and whatever? And the ways in which they've actually kind of weaponized we understand now the issues around single issue policies. They've weaponized it in a way to kind of detach and atomize, right? You say categorize. It's like, and that for me is, I agree with you. It's like, we actually have to re-engage with that conversation, and also that broader conversation around kind of like, labor movement and so on and so forth, but not to have them separate, but actually to bring those together.
Yeah, I guess what I'm talking about.
Things make categories.
Oh, sorry.
No, that's fine.
I guess when I'm talking about the subjectivities, I guess from my perspective as a trans person, myself was fortunate enough to be one of the few who attained middle class status, but is often very hesitant to like move jobs because I work for the city, which is one of the few kind of jobs where trans people develop and feel like they kind of have some sort of security. I feel like the people that I know who are trans are very connected with their own marginalized class status because they're living it every day, and either they are or other people they know are. So I guess that's just my feeling about the bringing together of these political actors. So I do think it's especially important in trans studies to think about people's connections to that motion.
Not to take a sharp left turn into representation, but as a fellow communications and media studies scholar, Sharif, this is a thought experiment. How would your Pits and Perverts framework how would you interpret a film like Billy Elliot's through Pits and Perverts?
So really, right, and of course, you don't get Pride unless you have Billy Elliot, Brast Off, the full Monty, so on and so forth. Because the other story here is the romanticization of a particular type of, it's what we call the Hovis, which is a type of like bread. And it was like this advert that used to run, and commercial used to run. It's like, oh, and the working class eating their bread and whatever, this bullshit. But yeah, no, it's absolutely that. And of course, what's really interesting about Billy Elliot is the way in which kind of like gender operates within this, and he still has, in order to retain his working class kind of roots, he can be a ballet dancer, but still he has to retain a certain kind of working class masculinity and some of it. So I agree, yeah. I mean, we've got it all over. Even bloody Pillion. Right? No, Pillion has this still kind of this really interesting kind of class, very English class thing that's going on there that I think really needs to be kind of like picked apart, the ways in which gender and sexuality and that kind of romanticized class narrative kind of plays out. Yeah, thank you.
So really, I don't know talking to you, but I love the movie Pride, and I was so excited that this presentation was happening, and I feel also very interesting. But I find it so interesting with this sort of thing where the UK talks about class so much, and when you're talking about and even when you're talking about there's the word Hovis, I feel like in the United States we have this idea of the white working class that is actually like this Hovis figure.
Yeah.
But we don't have like a specific name for this, so it feels like when people are talking about that type of person, everybody kind of knows what they mean, but then won't say it in the way that a lot of scholars do. So I'm definitely gonna carry that with me when I talk with some friends later about this conception.
Look up the Hovis adverts for the 1980s on this. They're kind of hilarious, by gun, back in the day. So,
Thank you so much for coming. I'm quickly right time to head to the next featured roundtable that's happening in the Shanxi. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for letting me your job. Let me get back for you. You need to share.
That's a fun